On the morning of May 4th, 1982, two Argentine Super Intendar strike fighters launched an attack on the British task force near the Falkland Islands all by themselves. They were armed with lethal Exocet anti-ship missiles, and in this video we'll see how just one of these inflicted Britain's most serious naval loss since the end of the Second World War. This video is brought to you by Fabulous. If, like me, you sometimes struggle to keep motivated and productive, then the Fabulous app might be a lot of help. It's a self-care app with a uniquely supportive tone, which uses behavioural science to help you build daily habits that can boost your productivity and mental well-being. These habits can be anything from drinking water to meditation to making sure you get your 5 fruit and veg a day. Something I personally find useful is inserting a 5-minute walk into my morning routine. If you work from home, having this pretend commute can be a great way of getting your brain ready to work. Fabulous can help you both by keeping track of these habits, there's more than 100 to choose from, and also providing dedicated programs designed to specifically help you achieve the well-being goals that you set. With Fabulous Premium, you can build and improve an unlimited number of habits in your routines and take part in all programs and exercises. You can start building your daily routine right now. The first 100 people who click on the link in the description below will get 25% off a Fabulous subscription. After the sinking of General Belgrano by HMS Conqueror, the Argentinian Navy returned its major surface warships to port, unwilling now to run the gauntlet of British nuclear submarines. This gave the British naval supremacy and meant that any counterattack on the task force would have to come from shore-based aircraft operating from Argentina's mainland, several hundred miles away. Argentina in 1982 had a large fleet of powerful Western-built aircraft, including American-made Skyhawks and Israeli-produced Daggers. The latest addition to this armada of more than 300 planes was the French Super Intendar strike fighter, which was designed to operate Exocet anti-ship missiles. Capable of delivering a 165kg warhead at over 700 miles an hour, the Exocet was a modern, highly dangerous missile, and the British knew it would be the single biggest threat to their ships during the Falklands War. As a key part of their naval strike force, Argentina had ordered 14 Super Intendars and 15 Exocet missiles, but only 5 of each had been received before France suspended deliveries in the wake of the invasion of the Falklands. With such a limited stock, it was decided that the Intendars would only deploy from their base at Rio Grande in pairs, when opportune moments to strike the British carriers arose. On the morning of May 4th, one such opportunity was presented when a Neptune reconnaissance aircraft detected the British task force southeast of the Falklands. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward had his flagship HMS Hermes about 75 miles south of Stanley. He was keeping his ships relatively close to the coast in order to support shore bombardment and reconnaissance operations being mounted against Argentine land positions. May 4th was expected to be a relatively quiet day, with a single air raid against Goose Green the only planned operation. 450 miles away, a pair of Super Intendars had other ideas as they took off from Rio Grande at 8:45 am. Piloted by Lieutenant Commander Augusto Bedecaratz and Sub-Lieutenant Armando Mayora, the Super Intendars flew east without escort, relying on surprise and the long range of their missiles to mount a successful raid. They would ordinarily not have the range to reach the reported British ships, but they were able to refuel in mid-air from a Hercules tanker to massively extend their range. 120 miles out from the reported contacts, the two aircraft descended to fly at just 50 feet above the sea, so that the curvature of the Earth would hide them from British radar screens. Flying on in poor visibility, at 9:56 am Bedecaratz and Mayora popped up and briefly switched on their radars, looking for the British ships. They found nothing, so dropped down to sea level once more, pressing on at more than 500 knots towards where their target should be. Less than 50 miles away, the British fleet was sailing southwestwards. The ships of the task force were strung out in an anti-air formation and had dealt with repeated false alarms over incoming hostile aircraft that morning. Furthest east were the most important ships, the carriers Hermes and Invincible, each accompanied by a goalkeeper ship armed with the short-range Seawolf missile, positioned as the last line of defence. In front of these were layers of protection, the most important of which were the 3 Type 42 anti-air destroyers, positioned 20 miles ahead of the main task force. Coventry, Glasgow and Sheffield were tasked with intercepting any hostile air attacks before they could reach the carriers and do critical damage. There were also Sea Harriers in the air running combat air patrol to the northeast, but due to the low cloud base on May 4th, their ability to quickly respond to threats was limited. At 9:56 and 30 seconds, HMS Glasgow picked up the radar emissions from the Intendar's first attempt to establish contact with the task force. Its operations room snapped into gear, correctly identifying the source as the Superintendar and broadcasting a warning to the rest of the task force. But HMS Sheffield, who was closer to the approaching aircraft than Glasgow, was silent. At that moment, the southernmost Type 42 was using her satellite communication system, which blocked out certain radar frequencies and meant that Sheffield could not see the same contacts that Glasgow could. Captain Paul Hodinott of Glasgow had previously banned the use of this system on his ship during daylight hours, but Captain Sam Soule on Sheffield had not done the same. At 9:58, Bedecaratz and Mayura again popped up for a radar sweep, now just 20 miles away from the task force. This time they could make out 2 radar contacts, one smaller than the other. Believing the larger ship to be an aircraft carrier, they pressed their attack and prepared to launch their missiles. By now, Glasgow had direct radar contact with the approaching strike aircraft. The ship's anti-air warfare officer, Lieutenant Commander Nick Hawkyard, quickly reported the incoming raid, but he was frustrated with the response of HMS Invincible, which was not convinced that this latest alarm wasn't another false warning as others had been that morning. The Sea Harriers on their patrol route were not diverted to intercept the incoming contacts. At 10 AM, now somewhat frantic, Glasgow radioed a warning of the incoming attack to Sheffield, but again there was no response. At this critical juncture, both the ship's anti-air warfare officer and one of the radio operators had stepped out of the operations room, leaving it rudderless. Sheffield had also still not made radar contact with the Argentinian jets. This was now partly because Glasgow had given the bearing of the contacts as being 235 degrees, but from Sheffield the aircraft would have shown up on a bearing of around 300. This confusion led to Sheffield's radar operators looking in the wrong place and seeing nothing. The Superintendars were now just 12 miles out. They turned sharply to starboard, lining themselves up firmly on HMS Sheffield. 10 seconds later, Sheffield's anti-air officer was urgently called back to the ops room over the ship's intercom. This was the first indication to almost all of Sheffield's crew that something was wrong. Before he could get there though, at 10:02 exactly, Bedecaratz and Mayura launched their Exocet missiles and turned away hard, to begin their sprint back to Argentina. With an Exocet travelling at more than 700 miles an hour on its way, Britain's ships now just had seconds to react. Glasgow quickly fired chaff, clouds of small metal filaments designed to confuse the Exocet's radar into missing the ship. On board Sheffield, the anti-air officer returned to the ops room but misidentified the raid as a pair of Mirage 3s, as he believed the fleet was beyond the range of the Exocet carrying Superintendars. Seconds later, the ship's bridge crew caught sight of the missile trails heading their way, but no message was relayed to the ops room, the captain, or to the crew. No chaff was fired. Aboard Glasgow, Captain Hodinott ordered his ship's Sea Dart missile system to engage the onrushing Exocets, but the system was designed to engage high-altitude missiles and struggled to lock on to the low-flying and fast-moving projectiles. Sheffield's Sea Dart, meanwhile, could not even see the Exocets on radar. Most of her crew was not even aware there was anything to be worried about. And then, at 10:03 exactly, time ran out for HMS Sheffield. The first Exocet, probably fired by Bedecaratz, smashed into the ship's starboard side amidships, causing a huge fire in the auxiliary machine room. The ship immediately lost half its power and its communications. Thick black smoke forced the evacuation of the bridge and the ops room, and a ruptured fire main crippled firefighting efforts. To make matters worse, the computer systems for the ship's missiles failed, leaving Sheffield defenceless in the face of any subsequent attacks. In the computer room, a team of 5 under Lieutenant Commander John Woodhead remained at their post, trying desperately to restore the ship's defences even as choking smoke filled the air and the blazing fire crept closer. They were eventually successful, but all 5 men perished in the process. Not long after the Exocet hit, the frigates Yarmouth and Arrow arrived to offer assistance, providing hoses and pumps to try and beat back the fire, rapidly engulfing the centre of HMS Sheffield. Helicopters began to evacuate casualties to HMS Hermes, where their arrival was captured by the shocked news cameras of the broadcast media. On Sheffield, firefighters battled for 4 hours against the fire in an attempt to save the ship, but it was a battle they steadily lost. By 1:50 PM, Captain Salt judged that the combat value of the ship was now essentially nil, and keeping the crew on board was not worth the risk that the fire might reach and detonate the Sea Dart magazine. He ordered abandon ship. The crew went across to Yarmouth and Arrow, while Captain Salt and some of his officers were flown by Lynx to Hermes to report to Rear Admiral Woodward. Woodward, grappling with the implications of that morning's events, told Captain Salt, "I suspect someone's been bloody careless." 20 men had died, and Britain had lost 1/3 of its specialist anti-airships, leaving the task force dangerously exposed until reinforcements in the shape of ships like HMS Exeter and HMS Cardiff could arrive. As the task force digested a serious blow, several hundred miles away, Bedecarut and Mayura were returning to base, having fired 40% of Argentina's Exocet stocks. When news reports of Sheffield sinking emerged, it was seen by some as revenge for the sinking of the Belgrano 2 days before, but that wasn't how Sub-Lieutenant Mayura saw it. "We didn't feel that it was a retaliation for the Belgrano, the operation was never for that, but we felt that we had proved that we had the ability to sink one of theirs too." The burning hulk of HMS Sheffield remained afloat for several days after she was hit. Once the fire had burnt itself out, the ship was taken under tow by Yarmouth. She reached the edge of the exclusion zone but began to take water on through the hole the Exocet had created. Eventually, Sheffield foundered and capsized, sinking into the Atlantic, where she rests today. The loss of Sheffield was a brutal shock to Britain. It was the Royal Navy's first warship lost by enemy action since the end of the Second World War, and a very sudden reminder to the British government and public of the realities of fighting a war. Militarily, it forced the Royal Navy to be more cautious with its task force, keeping further east and away from the Intendar's base at Rio Grande. But it also hardened their resolve to see the campaign through to a victorious conclusion. After days of fighting at sea and in the air, attention would now turn to the plans for a full-scale amphibious landing on the Falklands, and some of the most tense days of the entire war.